In 2019, a law would be proposed that would allow China to arrest Hong Kong citizens and bring them to the Chinese mainland for trial. Although this may sound insignificant, this action broke the traditions that had been laid out between Hong Kong and China. Modern Hong Kong can trace its roots back to 1842. At the time, it was nothing more than a Chinese fishing village of around 7,000 people. Although a small village at the time, the island's importance was not lost on anyone, as it could serve as a strategic basing point for the power that controlled it. It was also an economically important port for the British, who used the Chinese village as a base of trade. Luckily for the British, a small argument would occur between them and the Chinese. Britain at the time was importing mass amounts of porcelain, tea, and silk from China, things the British really liked. The only problem was, Britain didn't have much to trade with China. China wanted large amounts of silver, but the British didn't have any. So without any silver, they went to the next best thing. The Chinese were okay with this at first, until the Chinese population got so addicted that it made Mr. Pillow's crack addiction look like some sort of amateur hobby. They asked the British if they could stop, and the British said no. This angered the Chinese. During this time, 2 British traders in Kowloon, this little area above Hong Kong, got drunk and beat a Chinese guy to death because he looked funny. This angered the already angry Chinese, who demanded the British hand over the traders. The British, knowing the traders would be executed, refused. This angered the already very angry Chinese, who then cut off trade with Hong Kong, planning to starve the British and even their own citizens to get their hands on the 2 traders. The British threatened the Chinese that if they didn't trade food with them, they would fire on them. This is how that went. Give us food. No. Dibs. Dude, you can't do that. It's my land. Okay, and who's gonna stop me? I am. Good point. And just like that, the first Opium Wars were over, and Hong Kong became a British colony. Under British rule, the colony of Hong Kong would become one of the most prosperous cities in Asia. The city would have a rough start as the Chinese made it very difficult in the 1840s for Chinese merchants to conduct trade with Hong Kong. That would change during the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s, when hordes of wealthy Chinese merchants would flee China to seek refuge in the colony. In 1856, Britain and China would go to war a second time over opium, and the British would win again, adding the Kowloon Peninsula to Hong Kong's territory. By the late 1850s, only 20 years after it became a colony, Hong Kong had cemented itself as a major port city in the area and drew in many foreign investors. By the 1870s, the once small fishing village of 7,000 had grown into a city with a population of 130,000. In 1898, the British would secure a 99-year lease with the Qing dynasty in China for the new territories, which is the rest of the land up here, and this would end the colony's land gains. For the next several decades, the colony would continue to grow in population and wealth, not having to worry about things such as war or political turmoil. In 1941, the colony would see a short change in leadership and then go back to British management in 1945. Under Japanese rule, the people of Hong Kong were starved, sent to labor camps, raped, and tortured by the soldiers, with the city's population plummeting by the time the British gained control again. After World War II, the city began to prosper again as a major influx of refugees came from mainland China. They were escaping to Hong Kong because of the Civil War, but that wouldn't become important until later. It would be very important later. As the city's free economy churned on with trading from the 50s to the 90s, the country that had kept the colony safe for so long began to show signs that it wouldn't hold on to Hong Kong much longer. The 99-year lease was almost over, and the Chinese, now communist, wanted the city back. The people of Hong Kong begged the British to keep Hong Kong, and the British kept this in mind when it went into negotiations with the Chinese. You can have it. What? In 1997, the British handed over Hong Kong to the Chinese. The city now had a population of 6.5 million people and a gross domestic product of $178 billion per year, incredibly high for a city-state. The Chinese had guaranteed the British that they would not impose their communist laws on the free Hong Kong until 50 years had passed. This agreement is called the One Country, Two Systems Agreement, where Hong Kong would still conduct business as if it was a British colony, and the Chinese would respect their laws, courts, police, and the list goes on. This also expanded into the rights of Hong Kong citizens if accused of a crime. Under the One Country, Two Systems Agreement, if a Hong Kong citizen committed a crime in mainland China, they would be deported back to Hong Kong and tried by a court there. This pleased Hong Kong only a small amount because while their rights and laws have been safeguarded for the time, several decades down the road, these rights would, by and large, not exist anymore, as the Chinese would slowly replace them with their own laws. Before the British left the colony, they passed an amendment that allowed almost all citizens to vote in the elections. Before this, the representatives in the legislature and executive were elected by corporate electors and special interest groups. As soon as the Chinese took control, the city's economy began to stagnate. This was due to merchants leaving Hong Kong in fear of the Chinese and several crises that came about at the same time. These crises included the Asian financial crisis, avian flu outbreaks, and SARS epidemics, one after the other. The city's population also stopped growing, and for the next several years hovered around 6.5 million people. One has to remember that the Tiananmen Square massacre was still fresh in the minds of everyone, and the people and businessmen of Hong Kong feared that this heavy oppression would soon be on them. Fortunately for the colony, the strict oppression they feared didn't arrive with the Chinese takeover, but would follow slowly in the coming years. The government of Hong Kong saw some immediate changes, and over the years, the changes would start to wreak havoc with the original ideas and systems of Hong Kong. The first thing the Chinese did was revoke the bill that allowed the citizens to vote in the elections. Voting rights were given back to corporate electors and special interest groups. Now the chief executive, who is the leader of the Hong Kong government, would be directly picked by the Communist Chinese government. The chief executive also has the right to abolish the legislative branch, which is made up of the people who are supportive of the corporations that run Hong Kong, and also appoint all of the judges in the judiciary. This practice gives the chief executive complete power over the government, and since he is selected by the Chinese government, the Chinese generally have a large sway on Hong Kong's politics. Rather than the small economic and population problems in the early years of Chinese rule, Hong Kong would begin to grow again, with the Chinese slowly trying to turn Hong Kong into another Chinese city. From 1997 to 2019, the Chinese began to enact laws that, little by little, chipped away at Hong Kong's British rules and began to implement Chinese ones. A law called the National Security Bill was going to be passed in 2003, but failed due to large opposition. If it had passed, things such as speaking against the Chinese government would have been more harshly punished by the Hong Kong government. In 2014, the Chinese government began to conduct election pre-screening of the candidates for chief executive, meaning that all candidates would have to be supportive of the Chinese government to be able to run in the election and be chosen by the government. This began to tighten the Chinese grip on Hong Kong because the electorate would now only have pro-Chinese candidates to pick from. Finally, in 2019, Hong Kong would propose, under Chinese influence, the extradition bill. This bill would allow for the Chinese to arrest Hong Kong citizens for speech critical of the Chinese government without having to let Hong Kong know and try them for their crimes in a Chinese court. The proposition of this law was the breaking point for most of Hong Kong, who amassed in the streets to protest the law. Although protests had happened under British rule and when the Chinese tried to enact previous laws, this protest would be significantly different than the rest. The protest was the largest the city had ever seen, with 2 million people attending it. Although the protest began as a peaceful demonstration, it soon became violent. Police were told to put the protest down, as it was an illegal assembly that had not been approved by the government. As the police and protesters clashed for months, the Hong Kong government withdrew the extradition bill due to the protest's size and resolve. To the protesters, it looked like they had won, but they began to push more demands, such as the chief executive's resignation among others. The protest would shrink in size during mid-2020 until the Chinese stepped in and legally crushed it. The Chinese, without approval from Hong Kong, passed the national security law for them. Chinese national security agencies began to enter Hong Kong and arrest leaders and supporters of the protests and imprison them. After this, the protests died down as people began to fear that they would be next. The Chinese, through sheer force of their own power, have begun to remove the traditional laws of Hong Kong and replace them with their own. The protests, although gaining traction at first, soon subsided as the Chinese entered the city and began arresting the leaders of the movement. As the protests died, the future of Hong Kong's people would change forever.